Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me. I'm very pleased actually about the theme of this seminar, military and civil relations, because it has forced me to rethink my material actually through this angle, and it's been very useful. I would like to start with a brief introduction to the Women's Corps, what it was. The Women's Corps was a popular female movement in First World War Britain, whose main objective was to contribute to the war effort in a new capacity by promoting women's military war participation. The founders of the movement aimed to provide disciplined and trained female auxiliaries for the armed forces to replace soldiers in military support jobs and thus release them for frontline duty, thereby increasing the number of troops available for fighting and bring the war to a victorious conclusion. The movement had two distinct phases. The first one, between 1914 and 1916, was dominated by the paramilitary female volunteer corps, of which the Women's Volunteer Reserve was the largest. And just to kind of give you an image of the Women's Volunteers. So the Women's Volunteer Reserve was the largest of these four. It had a nationwide network of local companies, mainly in London and the South East, the Midlands, the North East, the North West, and one company in Scotland in Glasgow. And that's the most important one in the Women's Legion. These volunteer units initially hoped to participate in home defense by performing auxiliary duties for British troops in case of an invasion. Although they never fulfilled this role because there was no invasion, their voluntary canteen, clerical and transport work for local military stations led to regular, large-scale and paid employment with the army in Britain. This work and the paramilitary organization of the volunteers provided the model for the government-sponsored official female services between 1917 and 1919, which represented the second phase of the movement. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the Women's Royal Naval Service, and the Women's Royal Air Force, the three official female services, were established between 1917 and 1918 to relieve the manpower shortage of the armed forces. These organizations provided female auxiliary workers for domestic, clerical, driving, and technical posts for the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. Altogether, about 100,000 women passed through the volunteer and the auxiliary corps. Now, women's military roles divided opinions very sharply, both among the public and in the armed forces. In 1915, strongly worded letters written to the press protested against the khaki uniformed parades of the female volunteers, accusing the women of bringing the king's uniform and soldiering itself in contempt. Critics argued that such conduct, especially in wartime, was unpatriotic, helpful to the enemy, and should therefore be banned. So very, very strong words. At the same time, however, the volunteers received considerable support from politicians, businessmen, and army officers. Members of this circle spoke at the volunteers' official events, encouraged their work, and provided them with training facilities and employment. In the second half of the war, the public and military relations of the official female services were even more complex. While numerous army and naval officers tried to prevent women's employment at their station, others accepted and even applied for female auxiliary units and arranged special housing and office space for the women. Servicemen's attitudes were equally polarized. Many soldiers resented the arrival of the female army auxiliaries, refused to teach them their jobs, or even accused the women of infecting them with venereal disease. Others invited the female units to picnics, dances, and sports events. Public responses reflected similar ambivalence. Large sections of the population spread malicious rumors about the alleged immorality of the WAACs and demanded the auxiliaries' speedy demobilization at the end of the war, while enthusiastic crowds cheered contingents of the women at the Victory March in 1919. This diversity of attitudes has not been acknowledged in the existing literature. Regimental and popular studies of the official services acknowledged military and public opposition to the auxiliaries, but claimed that through efficiency and courage the women overcame these obstacles. In contrast, feminist scholarship has emphasized persistent hostility towards the Corps. Stressing public criticism and military prejudice, women's histories and gender studies argued that overwhelming refusal to accept women's martial participation generated enduring popular antagonism and discriminating policies towards the units. Both these interpretations are limited in several respects. Due to their focus on extreme responses, the former disregards continuing opposition which affected the Corps' status, while the latter fails to explain how the movement could not only survive, but expand if opposition to it was so widespread. Existing studies are also partial in that they concentrate mainly on the responses to the Corps instead of the interaction and relations of the female units and their civilian and military communities. Related to this view is a tendency to treat both public opinion and the armed forces as homogeneous entities with uniformly critical and unchanging opinions. Finally, both approaches examine women's military employment from very broad perspectives, either over an extended period between the First World War and almost the 1980s, or in the general context of women's war work. This is why I think they overlook the plurality and changes in the attitudes to the Corps. My paper here today explores the military and public relations of the female units to uncover how these facilitated women's martial employment in the face of opposition. The discussion focuses on the movement from its launch in 1914 to its demobilization in 1919. Within this context, I examine the policies of the Corps towards their civilian and military environments, as well as the responses of these parties to the women's initiatives. I define these groups, that is the Corps, public opinion, and the military, as vast networks of individuals, communities, and units, with a plethora of intersecting identities, interests, and ambitions. Through this approach, I seek to illuminate a full spectrum of their mutual relations and shifting attitudes. This close-up view reveals that the Corps' relationships were extremely varied, ranging from hostile rejection to ambivalent acceptance and friendly collaboration. My aim is to find patterns in this diverse web of relations in order to identify what determined opposition to and support for the Corps. Therefore, I'm concentrating on sections of the female units, public opinion, and the military, which actively interacted with each other, and explore their identities and interests using social historical analysis and a spatial interpretive framework. I can say more about this spatial framework when we come to questions and comments. Based on this, I argue that the nature of relations was determined partly by the shared or conflicting identities and interests of the three main parties, and partly by the changing policies of the Corps in managing their relationships. Okay, so I'm starting with the female volunteer corps. The policies of the early volunteer movement were defined by its metropolitan leadership, who launched the first female units in the autumn of 1914. Two partly overlapping circles dominated this group. The first one included pre-war suffrage campaigners like Vera Holme and Winifred Adair Roberts, while the other consisted of the hunting-shooting members of the country gentry and aristocracy, such as Mrs. Charlesworth. The Honourable Evelina Haverfield and Lady Londonderry, the colonels of the reserve, linked the two groups. Corps leaders' gender, political and regional identities were shaped by their pre-war occupations. Refusing to conform to traditional definitions of femininity, they made public speeches and participated in militant suffrage protests as suffrage activists, and were riding astride in breeches and driving in mannish outfits. Just to show you what that looked like. That's Evelina Haverfield in her riding costume, Vera Holme in her chauffeur uniform. She was the chauffeur of Mrs. Pankhurst and Christopher Pankhurst in the WSPU, and Mrs. Charlesworth, a hunting-shooting countrywoman with her hunting dogs which she breeded, the golden retrievers. As suffrage activists, several of these women had developed a collective war mentality, focused on fighting for a cause and unconcerned with public opinion. Crucially, most of the top leaders, including Haverfield, Londonderry and Charlesworth, were not local to the London borough where the reserves units operated, having spent much of their time with country pursuits or campaigning in the provinces. Corps leaders' ambition and strategy also derived from their pre-war activities. Seeking physical action and adventure by performing auxiliary duties in an invasion, they hoped to achieve this goal by launching a nationwide women's movement which would provide military training and secure martial work for the membership. The uniformed route marches of the Volunteer Reserve were designed to attain all these objectives. The main aim of these marches was to demonstrate the Corps' martial qualities and image, and thus obtain both like-minded recruits and employment from the military authorities. That's one of the route marches led by Winifred Adair Roberts, passing by Buckingham Palace in early 1915, and the later one from 1915 in London, by which time they actually had drummers, and eventually they had a drum and fife band to accompany the wintry marches of the volunteer units. Similarly to the suffrage campaign, the volunteer leaders also sought more publicity by alerting the press to their events and providing photo opportunities. In its early stage, the Volunteer Reserve made little effort to build good public relations. Despite widespread hostility to pre-war suffrage militancy and cross-dressing, Corps leaders in London adopted a strongly masculine military image for their units. This included army ranks and insignia, khaki uniforms with ties, and shorter skirts than customary. In addition, senior officers carried riding whips or canes, and some privates walked around in breeches which should have been worn under the skirt. Okay. In the group portrait in the middle, that's Evelina Haverfield holding the officer's kind of cane in full military uniform with Vera Holme, and the other image is Lady Londonderry in the khaki uniform of the Women's Legion, they are all holding, the canes and the gloves, which obviously indicates their officer status, and leather belts. Some corps actually also had some brown belts. The initial aims of the Volunteer Reserve were equally contentious. Corps leaders announced that besides cooking, driving, and signalling for the troops, the volunteers would also do patrol duty, dig trenches, and defend themselves from the enemy by arms if necessary. Therefore, all units practiced target shooting regularly. Corps leaders' portrayal of civilians was also controversial. Following the strategy of the suffrage campaign, the volunteers justified their existence by adopting a social group whose protection became their publicly defined objective. Thus, the reserve claimed that their main goal was the safeguarding of women and children in case of an invasion. However, in their effort to obtain recruits and military employment, Corps leaders increasingly contrasted their own martial identities and values of discipline, efficiency, and self-reliance with what they saw as the inferior qualities of non-combatants. Referring to civilian women as a disorganized rebel unable to do anything, they also argued that all able-bodied men should be in the fighting line, and suggested that young working girls should join the Corps instead of loafing in the streets and running after soldiers. Lack of respect for public sensitivities generated considerable antagonism towards the volunteers. What critical letters in the press indicate, however, was that the opposition was uneven regarding both its origins among the public and its effects on the Corps. Most opposition was generated in London, where public relations were neglected by the leadership, and in Newcastle, where the local company affiliated itself with the metropolitan movement quite early and adopted its policies. Although critics are difficult to identify, the contents of the letters, the newspaper's orientation, and the available signatures give some indication of their writers' identities and possible motives. These reveal that protest came mainly from social groups whose gendered identities and ideas were particularly threatened and offended by the Corps' aggressive militarism and patronizing attitudes. Of these opponents, the largest group were socially conservative upper-middle-class women writing to the Morning Post in London. Like most critics, they protested against the volunteers' khaki uniformed marches in London. Their letters, however, indicate that their main concern was the impact of such mannish dress and attitudes on traditional definitions of femininity and gender relations. Censuring the volunteers for cropping their hair, aping the bearing of men, and standing with their legs apart and saluting, these women argued that such behavior made women ridiculous to the men, and would therefore lower the standards of mutual respect between the sexes. This was a fairly common concern and is reflected in this Punch cartoon, as you can see a fully kind of dressed female volunteer saluting a Highland soldier in the street, and there is this terrible reversal of the sexes and this prospect of a sexual anarchy, which is what these women were particularly worried about. A smaller group of opponents was composed of civilian men. Their letters suggest that the volunteers' military ambitions hurt their masculine pride, perhaps because for whatever reason they had not themselves enlisted. One writer resented that the women volunteers would want to defend his family in case of an invasion, while two others accused the volunteers of usurping the military symbols of army officers holding the king's commission, perhaps kind of aspiring to these symbols which they didn't have. Simultaneously, however, the early volunteer leaders also generated support for the poor. Endorsement came from the pre-war social and political networks of the leaders, ranging from upper-class suffragists like Betty Balfour to female relatives of military leaders such as Lady Jellicoe or Kitchener's sister, and conservative MPs including Lord Beresford, Desborough, the Earl of Meath, and the Honourary Henry Chaplin. They all acted as patrons of the movement, chaired the volunteers' meetings, and spoke and wrote on their behalf. Besides social, political, and family links to poor leaders, Tory politicians supported the volunteer reserve because of their own interest in defence reform through organisations like the National Service League and the Duty and Discipline movement, which sought to extend military training to civilians. Suffragists, on the other hand, backed the corps because they sympathised with its aim to widen women's participation in national affairs. Support also came from the press, which was grateful for the exciting copy and photo opportunities provided by the corps' activities at a time of restrictive censorship. Therefore, it featured the volunteer reserve's training and praised its martial aims and image. The problem with this endorsement, with all this support, was that while it looked impressive on paper, in practice it actually provided limited help against public criticism. This was because these various support networks, the Tory politicians, the suffragists, the press, were not actually linked to each other, nor were they linked to the various London or Newcastle boroughs where the early volunteer units actually operated. Distant national and metropolitan figures could not offer tangible support in debates waged in local newspapers and neighbourhoods. This affected the London companies in particular. Public criticism divided corps leaders about the aims and image of the movement, leading to a break-up of the reserve into several new organisations in the spring and summer of 1915. Thus, while the volunteer reserve continued in London, it now competed with the Women's Reserve Ambulance, the Women's Auxiliary Force, and the Women's Legion. Now, in contrast to this situation in London, the thriving provincial companies of the volunteer reserve drew on wide-ranging and close-knit local support networks. The most active of these units were formed in Newcastle, Birmingham, Leicester, Tunbridge Wells, Glasgow, Derby, and Folkestone, mainly in the first half of 1915. Their success was due largely to the distinct social composition and aims of their leadership. The most crucial aspect of these corps leaders' social identity was that they were not only local to the area where their corps operated, but they were well-known, established, and respected members of the community, either because they grew up there, they married prominent local men, or they did voluntary and social work locally. Apart from titled ladies, who, similarly to the London unit, dropped out during 1915, most of them were married to local municipal leaders and men from the commercial middle class. Both the politics and the objectives of these women differed from those of the national leadership. Theirs was a politics of local patriotism and civic duty, linked to the aim of organizing women of the town to defend the local area if necessary, and through this demonstrate the support of the town for the national war effort, and thus reinforce the town's regional status. The gender identity of provincial volunteers was also distinct from the metropolitan units. This is illustrated by the expulsion of the Newcastle Company from the volunteer reserve by the London headquarters. The unit was struck off because its members refused to wear their skirts short, just below the knee, call their officers sir, or address each other by their surnames. Interestingly, these different ideas about gender were expressed in terms of the unit's regional identity. As the commanding officer of the Newcastle Company stated, quote, "Our members are not the type of women to conform to such an order. This sort of thing may well enough be in London, but in the North Country it is regarded without enthusiasm. It is felt that women can do women's work quite efficiently, without aping the sex to which they have no desire to belong." The strong ties of provincial volunteers to their hometown guaranteed them the support of the local political, commercial and military elites. Due to corps leaders' matrimonial links to municipal officials, the inaugural meetings of these companies were usually held in the town hall, chaired by the mayor and attended by local councillors, aldermen and other notables. Beyond family and social links, municipal dignitaries' backing also stemmed from their identification with the unit's objectives. Seeing the women's plans for home defence as an expression of local patriotism, they praised the corps and recommended them to the town's female population. At the inaugural meeting of the Stratford Volunteer Reserve, the mayor commanded the unit as follows: "Stratford has done great things since the war commenced. They expect her to do greater still, and they look to the women of Stratford to advance its fame and to prove that they were worthy daughters of the Empire." He trusted that the Stratford had set an example in its noble generosity and its son's sacrifice, so it might give a lead to the towns and villages with which it was surrounded in the organization and efficiency of its women volunteers. Such endorsement ensured the backing of local businesses and newspapers. The former lent the corps training facilities, while the latter covered all its activities and functioned as their notice board. The most crucial support, however, came from local army commanders. Many of these officers had links to the Victorian male volunteer movement or the Territorials, and recognized the female units as followers of the same tradition. More importantly, as army recruitment was in decline by 1915, these army officers hoped that the sight of female soldiers wearing khaki would shame the slackers into enlisting. Therefore, they helped the corps with their training, inspected their drill, and gave them their first jobs by inviting the volunteers to join army recruiting processions. So there is this developing relationship between the female volunteer units and local army officers who provide them with drill instructors, inspect their units, invite them to their barracks actually for joint drill, and then invite them to a tea party, etc. And they give them very kind of important pep talks about not worrying about public criticism, because the volunteers and the territorials had to deal with the same and just ignore it. The support of municipal officials and military officers enabled the corps to defend themselves from critics. In Newcastle, where the first female company was formed outside London, the volunteers received vital help from the mayor, who gave them permission to organize the safeguarding of women and children in case of an invasion. Further help was given by the local MP, the yeomanry unit, businesses and the press. This might have inspired members of the public to come to the volunteers' aid in the local paper when opponents criticized the local unit's uniformed parades. Rejecting critics' accusations, the writers, whose pseudonyms suggest old military connections, defended the company, praising its hard work and self-sacrifice. Similar developments also allowed the Metropolitan Unit to defeat their opponents. In April 1915, Colonel Willoughby Wallace, from the National Reserve, invited the London Battalion of the Corps to participate in a large recruiting rally of the army marching through Chiswick. 200 members participated in it, and officers of the Corps made sure they alerted the press, so the event was covered very broadly, generating numerous illustrated press reports about the patriotic work of the volunteers. A photograph, for example, with Mrs. Charlesworth, Colonel Charlesworth of the Women Volunteers, with Willoughby Wallace from the National Reserve, both on horseback as they were leading the march, was obviously pure gold in publicity terms. Equally, a photograph of the female unit, again led by Mrs. Charlesworth on horseback, saying, "When the women call, what men can hang back?" This and other similar jobs helped legitimize the Corps' military image in London. Responding to their critics in the Morning Post, members from various volunteer companies cited their recruiting efforts as well as their orderly duties in military hospitals and canteen work at railway stations and munitions factories as proof that their use of khaki was both justified and necessary. They argued that military authorities at these locations not only approved of their service dress, but actually required it as evidence of their authorized staff status. The local work of the female volunteers and the new public relations policy earned them significant support in their immediate communities, both in London and in the provinces. Besides recruiting, canteen and hospital work, companies also ran overnight hostels and clubs for soldiers and assisted local farmers on the land. In addition, they performed a series of jobs for the local community, including policing, ambulance and firefighting duties during air raid, shoveling snow, or running a parcel dispatching service for soldiers' families. All these activities received good publicity in the local press. At the same time, changing policies also improved the Corps' public relations. The new leadership in London toned down the reserve's military image, describing uniforms as serviceable, workmanlike and businesslike, and arguing that khaki uniforms were practical because they didn't show dirt. They also emphasized that they are darning, any kind of tears on their uniform rather than buying new, because obviously they have to be saving money. There is evidence that the new work projects and more tactful communication generated public support. Volunteers in most locations supported their work and administration from public donations. In 1916, Winifred Adair Roberts' company in Hampstead collected enough money locally to pay for the construction of a YMCA hut in Étampes in France. According to YMCA advertisements, it cost about £800 to build and equip such huts. In the same year, the Birmingham Company raised enough funds, about £600, to buy 2 ambulances, one for local use, the other for France, and to pay for the unit's administration costs for the rest of the year. Now, what I'd like to do is summarize my main points and then see how they apply to the official services in the second half of the war more briefly. So, to summarize the main points, support or opposition was determined partly by shared or conflicting social identities and interests. They were also determined by spatial relations. Local connections were vital in developing both military and civilian relations, while geographical or physical distance actually usually bred opposition between units and the military or the public. The policies of the Corps were also vital. But what's really important is that there was a fairly close link between military and civil relations. If the military supported the auxiliaries, then the public was more likely to support them as well. And what was also important is that these 3 separate factors, the kind of sharing or overlapping of social identities and interests, the spatial relations, and the policies, that they had to be kind of integrated. Obviously, military support was vital for these units, but it had to be local. It had to come from local units of the army or local army officers. Now, in the second half of the war, between 1917 and 1919, the same factors apply to explain the patterns in military and civil relations, but the numbers obviously are much larger in all 3 parties. We have about 90,000 women across Britain and in France on the Western Front working for the Army, the Navy, and then the Air Force. Public opinion, this is now basically the entire British public opinion, and all 3 armed forces, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. So it's obvious that the evidence to back up the argument is much sparser compared to the volunteers. Now, despite the good military and public relations which the volunteers developed by 1916, the situation in 1917 changes completely with the establishment of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in 1917. Although women worked for the army before, their numbers were relatively small. They either worked locally or in Whitehall departments, and they either worked as volunteers or civilian subordinates. Whereas when the WAAC is established in February 1917, initially these women are wanted for work in France, on the Western Front, which is very controversial. Much larger numbers, 10,000 women are wanted at least. And because they replace soldiers in army offices, depots, cookhouses, garages, etc., directly, the question of their status, their accommodation, their pay, and obviously their association with the troops becomes a matter of debate and becomes very, very controversial. Describing the military relations of the auxiliaries, as far as the armed forces are concerned, I would say there are three main positions. There is what you could describe hostile opposition and rejection, ambivalent or temporary acceptance of these women, and friendly collaboration. I would say that all three of these positions exist kind of simultaneously, parallel with each other, although initially obviously opposition dominates, and I would say towards the end of the war, at least acceptance or collaboration is what I would say is dominant. And again, this is determined by the interaction of shared or conflicting social identities and interests, spatial relations, and the policies of the corps. When Helen Gwynne-Vaughan, the first chief controller of the WAAC overseas, went out to France for the first time, she reported in her diary that opposition to women's work was almost universal. The generals were very friendly and polite, and they praised the scheme of substitution, but they all stated that their own station was the one place where women shouldn't come, because it's not really suitable for women. Now, there is a pattern. If you look at the opposition usually comes from certain sectors. Old, long-established and elite regiments or naval establishments are more likely to oppose the women. They find it difficult to accept work with women, partly because they've never done it. They have no experience working with women or civilians. So, for example, Chatham or Portsmouth in the Navy are more reluctant to accept women. There is also a story about the Coldstream Guards and how they treated the female cooks. One cook says they only wanted one thing from women. If they didn't get it, they got very nasty with us. Opposition is usually on grounds of morals, military discipline, work, and physical or mental qualities. Basically, there is a concern that women's presence would affect the troops' discipline. Also, that women would not be up to the job either physically or mentally. And I think most importantly, there is a question of masculine identities and masculine pride threatened in the case of these elite, old-standing regiments. Because of this, when the WAAC is established, a decision is made that no equivalence of rank is going to exist between the female officers and the male officers, because obviously the male officers did not want to be outranked by female officers and given orders. There's also no sharing of rank badges. There's a very interesting story. In London, a delegation of admirals is sent to the Admiralty to protest against the use of gold braid by women on the cuffs of their uniforms. They say gold is a male privilege, women should not use it. Another kind of group which is more hostile to the women is civilians in the War Office or in the Admiralty. Again, perhaps kind of more worried about their masculinity than serving army officers. The biggest opponent of giving uniforms and equal pay to the WAAC in the War Office is the financial member, Mr. Patterson, who is outraged, saying, "That's too expensive. We can always get patriotic ladies to work for less money than the men." He is really the main obstacle. And there are also soldiers out in France, for example, who are really saying, why are we having women out here? After all, we joined up to protect women and children from the enemy, so what are the women suddenly doing out here in France? And very interestingly, men who are doing support jobs in France, who are not in fighting units because their certification is C3, so physically they are obviously not as masculine as the fighting force. They have quite a lot of problem with these women, because with the arrival of the WAAC, they are actually reduced to the level of these female army auxiliaries. Other reasons for hostility: soldiers who are replaced by the women and redeployed further up the line to frontline units obviously are very hostile, and women are often told that they are sending these men to their death. So there are instances, for example, when the Women's Legion cooks arrive at their new stations, they find that the gas rings had been jammed by soldiers who departed for the front because of them. A lot of women drivers described that very often in the morning they found that the tires of their cars had been let off, the air had been let out of them. And very often soldiers sabotage teaching women their jobs and then blaming them for not being able to do those jobs just so that they could stay longer. The next position, acceptance. I would argue that many officers and soldiers, sailors, airmen, etc. accept the volunteers for various reasons. Once the women prove their competence, efficiency and willingness to work long hours, they actually accept the women. But it's quite interesting that when women first arrive, there are a lot of units where the soldiers and the officers test the women. Dolly Shepherd describes she's a driver. When they arrive in this garage in France, the officer tells her to go to the car and replace the valve sleeve in a Daimler, which was a very difficult thing to do. All the men crowd around her and watch her closely when she's doing it, but when she does it, they start cheering and clapping. A lot of this acceptance is, of course, kind of ambivalent and sometimes reluctant or grudging. For example, there's a Colonel Barnes who states that he was against women's work on grounds of morals, work and money. He says now that he has 15 WAAC cooks and clerks, he withdrew his objections on grounds of morals and work, but he still objected on financial grounds because he thought women's employment was costly and there are administrative difficulties. So it's a kind of reluctant, temporary acceptance. Spatial relations had a lot to do with oppositional acceptance. The greater the distance between the female units and the military, the more likely that there is opposition. So very often military officers and civil servants in Whitehall are more hostile or more kind of antagonistic to these women than actually the military units on the ground where the women were, where after a while a kind of community spirit kind of develops between them. The last position, friendly collaboration. The very important links here between the female volunteers and the auxiliaries. What I find is that collaboration and help is most likely to come from officers with either links to the volunteer force or the territorial force or the reserve forces, who either as directors or officers who had experience, or staff officers who had experience working with civilians in some parts of their career. Staff officers obviously have a shared interest with these women because they are the ones who have to supply material and manpower for the troops, and so they see the women as actually helpful allies. Examples would include the Quartermaster General Sir John Cowans, who agrees to Lady Londonderry's kind of offer to replace army cooks and army drivers with women in the Women's Legion in 1915 and 1916. But in addition to this background of he used to be, at some point he was the director of territorial forces. He also spends a lot of his social life with civilians. But there is also a family connection. He is very friendly with the Londonderrys. He's an admirer of Lady Londonderry, so that obviously plays a role. Other officers, staff officers who supported the WAAC, Lieutenant General Lawson, Sir Auckland Gaddis, Neville Macready, they all, in addition to having some battlefield experience, they usually spend a lot of time in their career with administrative work or working with civilians. Again, social connections, family connections are very important. Sir Auckland Gaddis, who is Director of National Service, when the WAAC is first established, he actually asked his sister, Mary Chalmers Watson, who is a doctor in Scotland, to become the first chief controller in Britain. Obviously he wanted somebody he could trust. Reserve officers, again, are very important. In the Navy, when the Women's Royal Naval Service established, the first naval establishment which is ready to accept women is Crystal Palace, which is a Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve Training Depot, and it's officers of the reserve who are happy to accept the women for the first time. Also, officers and men of less prestigious or new military units are more likely to sympathize with the outsider status of the women. So, for example, the Tank Corps and Helen Gwynne-Vaughan kind of strike up a very quick rapport when they are discussing how the War Office is treating new corps. Royal Engineer officers are usually very helpful. There's a good relationship between signal officers and the men. Also, perhaps the best relationship regarding the auxiliary services is between the RAF and the Women's Royal Air Force, because both of them are established at the same time in April 1918, and they have similar problems, so there's a great deal of sympathy between them. Another reason for the acceptance of women, a lot of officers and men who've been out in France, for example, for 3 or 4 years, they realize they miss female company. So the officers of the WAAC, for example, notice that male officers start dropping in for tea or dinner. And obviously this kind of produces a new policy in the WAAC. Female officers spruce up their mess rooms, their dining rooms, bring nice china, silk, tablecloths, etc. So because they realize that it improves diplomatic relations with the men if difficult problems can be discussed over dinner. So that obviously helps. And there are other shared interests. There's a very interesting entry in Helen Gwynne-Vaughan's diary. An army chaplain calls on her and tells her that although he was against the women at first, he realizes that the arrival of these women in France is actually good for the soldiers' morale, because these women are reminding the soldiers of their homes and families. And so actually it would be good to have kind of more association between the men and the women. So as a result of this, joint sports events, dances, whiz drives are organized between male and female units in France and then across Britain. And in France it's very noticeable that very often before army units return to the front, their officers request from the WAAC an invitation for a dance or a whiz drive to kind of improve the morale of the men before they go back to the fighting line. The men obviously very much appreciate this. Signs, evidence of improving relations. There is a sharing, an increasing sharing of army insignia, the symbols of rank, with the women. The first ones are the women signallers in the WAAC, who get the blue and white armband of the signallers, and they're very proud of that. Some units, for example, the 5th Army, they actually allow the women to wear the brassard of the army because of good relations. By the time the Women's Royal Naval Services is organized, Catherine Peirce, who is the director of the RANS, is allowed to wear admiral's buttons on her coat. But the most important piece of evidence in this is the Women's Royal Air Force. After initial problems, equivalence of rank is acknowledged between the RAF and the Women's Royal Air Force, and the same badges of rank and uniform for men and women are authorized, obviously with the difference of trousers and skirts. The course policies, I already mentioned some, but just very quickly. Generally a more cautious and respectful attitude, which is represented by people like Mary Chalmers Watson, Florence, Burleigh, Leach, and Catherine Peirce, are much better at building good relations than the more aggressive and pugnacious attitude of Helen Gwynne-Vaughan, who just loves the army and wants the full kind of works with everything. How much time do we have? 5 minutes. Okay. I think I will leave the civil relations maybe for the questions and comments. What I would just say briefly about them, that again identities, interests, shared or conflicting interests are very important, and spatial relations. But here the policies of the Corps are much more important. You probably knew about the problems, the image problems with the female army corps the WAAC had. There are these terrible damaging rumors about the alleged immorality of the WAACs. There are rumors that thousands of them have been sent home pregnant or with venereal diseases, or that they are army prostitutes sent out for the pleasure of the men. And I think a lot of this had to do with some policies of the WAAC, bad propaganda at the very beginning. Also Helen Gwynne-Vaughan's idea that men and women should be comrades, and associate with each other at an equal level, which is obviously not something that the civilian population understood. So the civilian relations are much, much more difficult, I would say, especially with the WAAC, better perhaps with the RANS and the WRAF. But what happens when the rumors get so bad that they actually affect recruitment for the women's corps, the army, out of necessity, the army needs men and therefore it needs women auxiliaries, so the army actually swings behind these women. There's a massive propaganda campaign with new posters, a commission an inquiring commission is sent out to France to look into the women's condition, and a big report is published, you know, to exonerate the women. But what also helps the public image of the floor, ironically, is the first female casualties in March 1918 in Etaples, when in a big German bombing raid, 9 women die as a result of a direct hit when they are sheltering in their trenches in the camp. And the military funeral, which I think is to some extent very much stage managed for public consumption. You know, hundreds of troops actually kind of accompany the hearse. Soldiers are lining the streets and saluting the Hopkins as they go by, and this is obviously very much discussed in the press. So this funeral and the female casualties are seen as a kind of watershed to some extent, after which perhaps the rumors somewhat subside. Okay, thank you very much.